we are with Ryan Berg from American Enterprise Institute. He's a research fellow and he recently published a very interesting paper about Pcc, the Brazilian criminal group. Thank you for joining us, Ryan.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
I found your paper very interesting because you try to analyze the story of Pcc, having in mind the future of this criminal group that is a concern not only for Brazil, but I think for South America and also for Europe. What's your feeling? I mean, how Pcc changed over the years, starting from the prison until nowadays?
Well, thanks for the question, Maria, and thank you for highlighting the report, which was titled Breaking Out. And really, it was meant to show how much the PCC has really grown over the last 4 or 5 years, especially since the ending of a truce between the two largest criminal factions in Brazil, the Comando Vermelho and the Primeiro Comando, or the PCC. And there was this real big expansionary push at the end of 2016 or in early 2017 to move into new areas where the PCC hadn't established a very firm presence yet. And so the report really catalogs some of the growth within Brazilian states, but also internationally. So now the PCC includes or counts a presence in nearly all 26 states in Brazil, and the Distrito Federal, or the federal district, and some of the other countries in South America. So we're talking about Paraguay, Bolivia, small presence in Peru, a bit of a presence, although not much, in a country like Colombia, possibly in a country like Venezuela, although we don't know because the reporting isn't very good, and international links even further abroad. We had a recent arrest of a high-level operator who was close to the PCC leadership in Mozambique. We know that the PCC ferries drugs to the Middle East and to Europe. And so it seemed to me that this organization was on a very important march across the hemisphere and even further abroad. And that's why I decided to write the report.
How was it possible that PCC could grow up in this specific way? In your paper, you highlight some foreign contributions, for example, the Chilean criminal Norambuena, that really taught very important technique to PCC. I can add that the contribution of Italian Camorra, Tursi brothers in prison, taught a lot of stuff to PCC members. So PCC members were brilliant, were smart, they took advantage of a special time in Brazil. I mean, how they become so powerful?
Part of it was through neglect, because the Brazilian prison system, as many of us who watch organized crime know, has become a very important node within the Brazilian organized crime landscape, and even within the South American organized crime landscape. And so neglect of prisons have allowed, I think, groups like the PCC to proliferate within them and to use them as a base of power to run an organized crime empire that obviously extends far outside of the prison walls. Another thing is what you mentioned, which is the fortuitous links that they managed to create with a number of other groups operating similarly illicit empires in the hemisphere. And so to your list, I would add groups like Hezbollah and other groups involved in illicit activities in South America, building these bonds and eventually integrating themselves into a number of different supply chains. And so what really interested me when I wrote this report was how the PCC had evolved, not just from a drug trafficking organization, but from an organization that has its hands in a number of different illicit markets. Anything from the illicit sale of auto parts from cars that have been systematically stolen in major urban centers like Sao Paulo, driven to the border of Paraguay and Bolivia, broken down and scrapped and sold for parts. Upwards of 20% of Brazil's petrochemical industry, fertilizer industry is illicit, and the PCC has quite a large role to play in that. And so there are myriad industries in which the PCC has asserted itself, and that is definitely demonstrative of how it's been evolving as a criminal organization from the early days, much more focused on drugs, now to an organization that's highly developed and focused on a number of different illicit markets.
What about the PCC relationship with the United States? I mean, what did you find?
The PCC relationship with the United States?
Yes, because you, in a paragraph, you mention the issue of the weapons. So I think that mostly the Florida region, it's important for PCC, for some part of the criminal chain. So.
Yeah, we found a few instances of money laundering through United States banks. And a couple instances, as you mentioned, of weapons trafficking, weapons that originated out of South Florida. The particular case that I mentioned in the report is one that was broken up by the U.S. Attorney's Office in combination with the DEA, I think late last year, and that one was going through Argentina and coming up through Argentina and Paraguay, and then eventually going into Brazil that way. But the PCC definitely had I think the PCC was the principal intended recipient of that large shipment of weapons that were foiled by the DEA and the Southern District Attorney.
Yeah, because you mentioned Operation Patagonia Express. That's why I was asking. So what about money laundering? Because as we know, when we have a lot of money coming from drug trafficking, we need to wash this money. So I think that the power of a criminal group could be really measured by the capacity to launder the money. The PCC is professional in it, or is just starting?
I think this is one of the areas in which the PCC needs to evolve further in order to grow its criminal empire. One of the areas where it's still in a sort of rudimentary phase is the money laundering aspect. And purportedly, when Gilberto Aparecido dos Santos, or alias Fuminho, the gentleman who I mentioned before was captured in Mozambique back in April, he not only was looking at creating greater links between the PCC and sub-Saharan African groups, but also looking for other routes to launder money and proceeds for the PCC. Allegedly, the Italian mafia is very strong in certain countries in sub-Saharan Africa, the Serbian mafia as well. And we're still figuring out, I think, some of the links that he was trying to make with some of those groups for the PCC. But as we've talked about before, I think one of the greatest weaknesses of the PCC right now is its very rudimentary phase that it's in for its money laundering operations. And the next frontier for the PCC will be to refine in its second and third generation of money launderers its methods for washing its money and getting its illicit proceeds into licit forms of banking and finance.
In your paper, you highlighted 3 recommendations. The first one is isolation. Isolation, as you know, was really helpful for fighting against the Cosa Nostra. Il 41 bis was an article of law obliging a judge to ask for important mobsters to be taken prison in a very isolated way. What about PCC? And do you think that this is the only recommendation you can highlight, or actually, as you did in your paper, you can see other skills or other tools to really fighting against the power of PCC?
Well, I think it's one tool among many that we have, both as the United States and Brazil, and what we can do cooperatively as well. What I mentioned in the report is the so-called regime disciplinar diferenciado, which is essentially like a solitary confinement in Brazil. And back in March, I believe it was, of last year, the Bolsonaro administration moved Marcola, the head of the PCC, into a regime disciplinar, a special disciplinary regime. And so he is reportedly in solitary confinement for something around 18, 19, 20 hours a day. He finds it, I think, very difficult, or far more difficult than he did before, to be able to control the day-to-day functioning and matters of the PCC. Combined with the Fuminho arrest in Mozambique, the group has definitely had some setbacks of late. But when it comes to the regime disciplinar, the special disciplinary regime, you have to remember that Brazil only has a certain number of spaces for this kind of solitary confinement, and it's not many. I don't remember the exact number, but it's not many. It's not nearly enough to use on all of the members of the PCC's leadership. So the politicians in Brazil, the security officials, need to be very selective about who is helping to run the group on a day-to-day basis, and use those limited spots wisely. Another suggestion that I made in the report was to actually desegregate Brazil's prisons, which are horribly segregated right now, despite laws on the books mandating desegregation. And so in many times, if you have a common criminal who goes to a Brazilian prison, they maybe don't have an affiliation yet with a Brazilian organized crime group. They get one very quickly after arriving. And in some cases, we've heard stories of judges deciding which wing of a particular prison a prisoner is going to be housed based on the faction that controlled the neighborhood that they came from. Under the assumption that they too must be affiliated with this particular faction. And so desegregation could go a long way into sort of breaking up some of the monopolies that groups have on particular prisons, and especially over particular prison wings. Another issue is the money laundering. I went after in the report the tri-border area, where the PCC still does quite a bit of illicit activity. Obviously, this is going to involve a lot more cooperation with the Argentines and with the Paraguayans, but I think that region can be cleaned up quite a bit. I think the U.S. also would like to help, and there's even a regional institution we can do it with. It's called the 3+1 group. So I'll stop there, but those are just some of the recommendations beyond solitary confinement for dealing with the PCC problem, because I think solitary confinement is just one piece of the overall puzzle when we're talking about dismantling the PCC.
What about the ports? Because one of the main problems here in Brazil is the control of the ports. The port of Santo is in total control of PCC, and now they're also choosing other ports in the north, in the south of the country. And actually, the cocaine travels from Brazil through the ports. So, what you can suggest?
That's right. Yeah, the port of Santos, reportedly Suape, and also Fortaleza in the north, heavily influenced or controlled by the PCC. A lot of it is going direct to Africa, the Middle East, and Europe from those ports. The report mentions a beefing up of customs officials at these ports, and a use of greater technology to try to scan cargoes. Even these are not necessarily foolproof recommendations. We know from looking at other cartels, such as Sinaloa, how creative some of the groups can be in terms of where they're hiding drugs. Reportedly, El Chapo was hiding cocaine in tamale jars. And so, these can be very creative schemes that can sometimes elude customs officials. But I think, beefing up customs agents at the ports, and beefing up intelligence operations as well. I'm very enthused by the fact that the DEA, some Brazilian intelligence agencies, and the local Mozambique authorities were able to follow Fumino for as long as they did and to eventually make an arrest, I think that augurs well for future operations of a similar kind against other kingpins in the PCC.
Thank you so much, Ryan, for joining us. Thank you.
Maria, it's a pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.